Alright, y'all. Hello. It is Friday. I hope you're going to have an awesome weekend. Today we're going to be looking at something pretty fun. Why did American cars fail in Europe, right? During any iteration, they've tried to go over there during any decade, especially the last 30 years, you could say. Why did American cars fail? I'm sure there are many different reasons. I'm sure a couple of them I might be able to predict or just think out of my head right now. It is interesting because on face value, I think some American cars look really nice, right? I think we definitely have the looks nailed down. We have some unique vehicles. I know some of it's going to be maybe quality concerns, fuel consumption. That would be my guess. And that's size, right? We make a lot of bigger cars too. Although I don't think that could be the sole reason. You have European vehicles that are large, right? You guys still have vans. You still have big, German cars, big British vehicles like Land Rovers and such. I think there's a lot more that goes into it than meets the eye, so that's why I'm going to try and learn about this today. So I look forward to your thoughts as well. This is from Core Motive. This will be linked in the description down below so you can watch the whole thing uninterrupted. Let's go ahead and dive into this. And right away, before we even start, I see a Chrysler 300 here. This body style was awesome. My parents had one. This was a great car. It's actually, I would say, a hybrid between an American car and a European car, only because this had Mercedes architecture or DNA, basically. It was a Mercedes platform. And as you would expect, rode excellent at any speed, including highway speeds. Awesome car. Of course, it was very fast with the 5.7-liter Hemi, of course, Chrysler V8 as well. The reason I pointed out is because this is a wagon. That's cool. We never had a Chrysler 300 wagon in the States. Of course not, right? Wish we would have. That's pretty neat. We did have the Dodge Magnum wagon, but admittedly, this kind of looks better, actually, in Chrysler trim. Anyway, let's go.
Why did American cars fail in Europe? Let's explore. I'm sure you're all aware by now that American cars and American manufacturers simply couldn't take off in Europe. No matter how much they tried, two of the big three simply couldn't get enough people interested in their cars. Why did this happen? Well, the simple answer is they didn't do it properly. And that requires us to start with looking at the one automaker that did do it properly. Ford. Ford is, to all intents and purposes, an American automaker. However, when...
That's true. Before he even gets into it, of course, it's going to come down to execution, right? You can always have a plan or an assumption. Hey, let's go into a big market, right? We're here doing good in North America. Let's move on over to Europe. But of course, saying things and then executing that plan in reality is, of course, a different thing. It's probably better to get some local input on things. I think Ford probably did that more than Chrysler or GM, but let's see.
When it came time to expand into the European market, Ford actually put a fair amount of thought into it. They did have a presence before that, but the Blue Oval's European outfit, aptly named Ford of Europe, was founded in 1967, merging the automaker's UK, Germany, and Ireland offshoots. That's the Republic of Ireland, by the way. In 1967, the first model to appear from this new merger was the original Transit, which would go on to become the literal face of vans in Europe, certainly the UK, and rightfully so. Ford of Europe continued to do the European expansion properly by opening production facilities all over Europe. Today, the European arm of Ford operates 7 manufacturing facilities on the continent in the UK, Germany, Romania, Turkey, and Spain. Ford also did this whole thing right by developing and designing cars specifically for the European market. The Fiesta, although they tried to market it to North America, which failed miserably, went on to become such a huge success in Europe that they discontinued it last year. Nice. Yes.
They don't make the Fiesta in Europe anymore? God, that always had like random little phases where it came to North America. And, you have a niche market, like some people like them here, but a lot of people, of course, in the masses don't. It's too small, right? Everyone loves big cars here. But I always thought it was pretty cool, especially the sporty models like a Fiesta ST or something. I'd love to drive one someday just to see how they drive. I've seen them, of course, on the road. But yeah, I would think that car would be like totally European, like perfect for a lot of European countries. Why would the Fiesta end? That's very bizarre.
Yes, I'm also bitter about the Fiesta's discontinuation, but it really was hugely successful in Europe, and the same applied to one of the C-segment's darlings, the Focus. Ford's first crossover SUV specifically designed for Europe, the Kuga, also did and still is doing great, and the same could be said of their Europe-specific minivans, the C-Max, the S-Max, and the Galaxy. Galaxy spelled with a Y at the end, by the way.
Oh, wow. That's confusing because they do have a Galaxy IE. Okay, so I'm gonna guess the Fiesta might have ended because of the immense rise of small, compact SUVs, crossovers, and of course, you guys have a lot of minivans at show still. That segment is pretty much dead here in the U.S., but it has been taken or replaced rather by, like I said, even in the U.S., small crossovers, small SUVs. Those are like numero uno. They're number one now. If you're not buying a pickup truck, because of course pickup truck sales are still through the roof. Although I think they're ridiculously expensive. So
the way, which all showed the continent that minivans don't have to be boring. So there we are. Ford of Europe did everything correctly as far as an expansion to Europe is concerned, which is why they're still very successful here. So what happened to the other two? Let's start with everybody's favorite manufacturer of totally reliable cars, trust me bro, General Motors. Like Ford, General Motors also had a pretty substantial presence in Europe by the latter half of the 20th century. They had acquired Opel fully by 1931, and then in 1990 they acquired Saab and managed to destroy them in just 20 years. Great job. 4 years prior in 1986, GM also officially formed General Motors Europe, which relegated GM's operations in Europe to Opel, Vauxhall, and then Saab. Now we arrive at the early to mid-90s. This was the time when another, seemingly unrelated but actually very relevant to the story, automaker was entering the European market. Daewoo. Daewoo cars started to trickle into Europe in the 90s with a focus on value for money. The Tico...
May I, before we get into this, because I do want to hear about Daewoo. I don't know much about them at all. Let me say something about GM, all right? Big history with GM in my family, especially just in my fleet of cars. I will say this about GM, and I know you're going to have a different opinion, and that's fine, but I'm talking based on fact, based on what I've experienced. GM, the big thing with them is electronics. Little things, right, start to happen, then they lead to big things. So little things like door locks, heated seats, random stuff around the interior of the car starts acting wonky, and it's an annoyance. It's not a deal breaker. It's not like the car won't drive, right? You just notice once the car is a few years old or 10 years old, whatever, stuff starts acting weird and going out, right? But unfortunately, it's not just that. That leads to bigger issues. So we have, or should I say had, a GMC Yukon XL Denali. So that's a big, like Suburban, basically. Huge SUV. Denali is like the luxury one. Now, of course, we bought it used. I would never pay the absurd prices for a new one. This thing was literally 20 years old. Here's the shame about GM. The engine is perfect. This has high miles, almost 200,000 miles. I'll put whatever that is in kilometers on the screen. The engine is healthy as a horse. It is incredible. Very powerful. Sounds amazing. Their V8s are incredible. GM. I'm sorry. They really are. The driveline, the four-wheel drive, everything. It's great. Here, it's a shame because that's the heart of the vehicle is your drivetrain. The drivetrains are great for GM. In my experience, but the electronics fall apart around it, then it gets parasitic draw. If you don't drive it for like 2 days, it doesn't start anymore, right? It's dead. So like these things happen over time. It used to be extremely reliable, drove it across the country all the time, and then just one day it starts falling apart electronic wise. Things start going crazy. The seats, features stop working, and that's the problem. So that's the problem I do agree with. GM has a major issue with that stuff. So the solution is if you want to buy a GM, you buy something really old. So I still have a 30-plus-year-old Chevy truck, Chevy 350 small block engine, V8, right? Sounds amazing, runs amazing, shifts amazing, four-wheel drive works. It's an awesome truck to drive. And because it's so old, it doesn't have barely any electronics in it. That's the key. So that truck still works. It still drives. No parasitic draw, no BS, right? It's awesome. So that would be my advice. Buy really old GMs and you're okay. But if it's anything that's supposed to be luxurious and tons of features, unfortunately, unless it's brand new, it's probably not going to work very well. And it's sad to admit that, but it's true. All right, back to, let's see what this is about.
Based on the 80s Suzuki Alto was a beats-taking-the-bus type of vehicle, but it sold like hotcakes, especially in former Yugoslavia. One above that was the Nexia, which was a small, Golf-ish sized hatchback, and you could have a sedan too. At the top sat the Espero, which wowed journalists at the time for offering a ton of equipment for basically no money. Continuing into the late 90s, Daewoo's Lanos, Nubira, Evanda, which was also known under 10 different other names, and the horribly ugly Takuma were all doing fine in Europe.
Haha, look at this thing. I gotta learn more about them in another video. Daewoo? I don't think we ever sold those in the US. I don't think. What a weird, what an interesting model lineup.
Europe. And then Daewoo went bankrupt and General Motors scooped them up in 2002. With General Motors now at the reins of Daewoo, they devised one of the stupidest, most befuddling strategies I've ever heard. General Motors founded Chevrolet Europe in 2005 in Switzerland with the promise that the Chevrolet brand would return to Europe. However, there was a problem. The real Chevrolet's lineup back then was entirely unsuitable for the European market. The Avalanche, the Impala, the Silver...
Yeah, see, I'm glad he's showing these. These, I kind of get, right? I don't have to live in Europe for 10 years to understand this. We all know the differences. We can all see media and hear each other's experiences and travel and whatever. This makes sense for America. And these are, like I said, generally really reliable. The drivetrains are hard to beat. If you think a GM V8 is unreliable, you're extremely ignorant and uninformed. The engines are great. You literally just change the oil on these things, and they run forever. Except, of course, brand new ones. Now, post-2020, GM has ruined their reputation even for V8s. Look into those recalls if you must. Now, electronics and such, that can be a gremlin. That's another thing. Anyway, these are generally good. The problem is, this is a big vehicle, right? And why would someone, I'm trying to picture, like someone in Amsterdam or someone in London or wherever, right? Why would you have this? This doesn't make sense. Maybe if you have a big property or you're a farmer, I can see, trucks. That's another thing. But that's not most people. So, yeah, I don't see these selling like hotcakes in Europe. They're not going to fit well. They're not going to drive well for the terrain. I've seen the beautiful twisty streets and tight, narrow places. I guess at face value, it kind of makes sense with a lot of these. Even Chevy Impalas are big.
Silverado, the Blazer, you get the idea. Big cars, even bigger engines, terrible gas mileage.
None
of these qualities are something that the average European buyer was looking for. So what did Chevy do? They rebranded Daewoo models from their Korean arm as Chevrolets and sold them in Europe. Yep, instead of doing the Ford thing and opening proper manufacturing facilities in Europe and designing cars specifically for the European market, Chevy just crossed out the letters Daewoo and wrote Chevrolet in Sharpie. And hey presto, new car. This resulted in abominations like the Chevy Spark, the Aveo, the Lacetti, the Captiva, and my personal nut favorite, the Orlando. Sure, you could still buy the Corvette and the Camaro in Europe, but these were meant to be Chevy's volume sellers.
Yeah, we didn't get any of those here except the Chevy Aveo. We did get those, but again, those were not popular here. GM also tried to sell Cadillacs to Europe, a market pretty much monopolized by the Germans, right? Look, I guess you can applaud them for trying, but Cadillacs are nice, but dude, what a behemoth. You're trying to enter a luxury sedan, luxury SUV market versus Audi, Mercedes-Benz, Porsche, BMW, the list goes on. That's a intimidating, almost impossible boss fight there, right? Like, that is not happening.
I think that the only somewhat good car to come out of this whole Daewoo bullshit was the Cruze. They were in Macedonia volume sellers because Macedonia is a poor-ass third-world country and people needed cheap cars. Eventually, Chevrolet withdrew from the European market in 2013. By that point, GM had already shuttered Saab due to their bankruptcy issues a few years prior, leaving Opel as the only presence General Motors had in Europe. Until Stellantis acquired Opel in 2017 and made them 15 times better, that is. So there we are. Chevrolet failed in Europe because the Chevrolets that most people were buying were just thinly disguised cheap Korean cars that were about as desirable as getting a sledgehammer to your face. That leaves us with the last remaining member of the big three, Chrysler. Originally, Chrysler had a...
I'm anxious to hear about this. I'm a car guy. I like all brands. I'm interested. I'm not like too brand loyal, but I've always had a soft spot for Chrysler. We've always kind of been a Chrysler family, my extended family. I obviously worked for them a long time ago. Interesting company. Say what you will, but I've always, liked older Chryslers. If we're talking about like the muscle cars, I like them the best. Chrysler and Dodges and Plymouths. Yeah, this might be brutal. Let's see.
Decent presence in Europe thanks to the merger of Simca, Roots, and Barreiros. Apologies if I didn't pronounce that correctly. And eventually the PSA group would continue selling Chrysler vehicles throughout the 80s badged as Talbots. Or at least I think so. That's all the sense I could make of the research I did online. It's a little complicated. So that technically means that Chrysler did the Europe presence thing properly at first. They rebadged various vehicles from the aforementioned brands, all of which were European, and sold them as Chryslers in Europe. That's fine. So what happened? Well, Chrysler was acquired by Daimler AG in 1998. Leading to the creation of Daimler Chrysler. This gave Chrysler money, which they would eventually burn completely, and Daimler was losing so much money on Chrysler that they would sell them again in 2007. However,
to Cerebus, I believe, and they had them for just a little time, and then Fiat stepped in, and that became FCA. I was under the FCA umbrella when I worked there.
This also gave Chrysler a channel to re-enter Europe once again. And they did. Now, as I mentioned up there, GM's big mistake was convincing Europeans that they're buying a Chevrolet when they were in fact buying a Daewoo. In other words, they plucked cheap cars from their Korean arm and sold them to Europeans. So what was Chrysler's big mistake? Chrysler's big mistake was not bothering with basically anything. The relaunch in Europe featured the compact Neon, the Stratus midsize sedan, and the...
Oh, interesting. You had the Neon as a Chrysler?
Anything.
Oh, that's so weird to see a Chrysler grill and badge on a Neon. So the Neon here was the Dodge Neon, or you could save money. It's weird that they did this. You could actually buy a Plymouth Neon. Slightly different styling. The Plymouth was cheaper, I believe. Now, this is surprising to hear. Why? And please, tell me down below, why would this not sort of sell? I would expect this to be car of the year or the #1 seller in any European country. Of course not. But wouldn't this have some sort of presence? It is small. It is somewhat fuel efficient. These were charming, but they're cheap, right? Again, maybe the cheaper cars from European makers were just better quality and better to drive. Maybe that's what it comes down to. But this is interesting to see.
Neon, the Stratus midsize sedan, and the Voyager minivan, or as you may know it, the Town & Country. Sure, the Voyager offered a diesel engine and a manual transmission because...
They had diesel manuals for Chrysler minivans? Okay, you guys are awesome. What? We never got that one here. That would be sick. That one was, this, by the way, has carried Chrysler for decades in the U.S. So Dodge Caravans and Chrysler Voyagers, these minivans, even this body style, which looks to be from the early 2000s, these are still on the road today. These are reliable. People have literally almost every intersection you go to in the U.S., in any city, you're going to see a Chrysler Group minivan from any year. You might see a 1999, you might see an '06, you might see a 2014, you might see a brand new one. Chrysler minivans was a absolute grand slam for them. And, these are still the most relevant product for them that you do see in the U.S. But again, with regards to Europe, this might be a little too big, bigger than people would want over there.
The Town & Country. Sure, the Voyager offered a diesel engine and a manual transmission because Europe, am I right? The Stratus, which was actually a Dodge vehicle, by the way, was available with either a 4-cylinder or a V6 engine. Remember, mid-size sedan in Europe in the 90s, with no diesel power. Here's an interesting fact. The cops in Macedonia used the Stratus for the longest time as a patrol vehicle. And as far as I've heard, all but a few of them went memories up, and I'm pretty sure that nobody else except the police force actually bought them as civilian vehicles. Either that or they all exploded or destroyed themselves. I don't know. Chrysler's not bothering with basically anything continued well into the late 2000s. The widely hated Dodge Nitro was worse than...
Americans hated this too. I am a Chrysler fan, like I said. And I'm sitting here saying, what the hell was that? That thing is terrible. I don't know how this ever became a production vehicle at all. These did horribly here. I would imagine they would do even worse anywhere else on Earth. These are terrible.
Other European SUVs in just about every way, and it was too big for Europe. The 300C, while it did receive a wagon version, which was just a Dodge Magnum with a front-end swap, and a diesel engine from Mercedes, was still worse than...
Wow, you guys have, of course, had a diesel version of this. That is so freaking cool. Wow, that is cool. Yeah, we didn't get the diesel here.
The European competitors in just about every conceivable way. Chrysler even tried to sell the widely hated Sebring to European customers.
Now, these weren't... This body style, the earlier Sebrings did okay, but they didn't last long enough. This body style didn't do well here. These are just... They're by then, Chrysler had such bad quality. The interiors are bad on these. The car looks cheap. Like, it's like they didn't even try with these, I admit that.
Yes, that includes the convertible too. Again, these were all vehicles designed for the American market, and Chrysler simply brought them over and updated them slightly to meet European regulations. They were practically unchanged from their American counterparts.
Okay.
And that's a problem because it's a well-known fact that American and European car buyer tastes are vastly different.
Yes.
Oh, how could I forget? Chrysler also tried selling the PT Cruiser in Europe. That went about as well as you'd expect. The writing was on
Horribly.
the wall. The 300C completely lost to the E-Class A6 and 5 Series, which is hilarious because the 300C of that time was based on the E-Class. The Stratus, meanwhile, lost out to stuff
was
like
literally
the Passat, the Honda
Mercedes-based.
Accord, the Renault Laguna, the Audi A4, the Mercedes C-Class, and so on. The Jetta and every other C-segment sedans were running rings around the Sebring, and every other European minivan, the VW Charan, the Ford S-Max and Galaxy, yes, they were made by Ford of Europe, it counts, the Peugeot 807 and its siblings kick the Voyager's ass 10 times over. Eventually, Chrysler just completely lost its mind and decided to continue its presence in Europe in an entirely new and balls-to-the-wall way. The second generation Lancia Thema was the second generation Chrysler 300C.
Whoa, that's the newer 300 with a Lancia badge. That is crazy. So they tried to do this?
With a few Lancia badges, and the Lancia Voyager was the same thing but for the later town and country. I also realized I completely forgot to write in the script that Lancia models were sold as Chryslers in the United Kingdom for no reason that I can think of. There probably is a reason, probably a weird, unusual reason either way. They did the long walk of shame back to North America, and eventually they wound up selling to Americans all of 2 cars, one of which recently went out of production. Nowadays, Stellantis is focusing its efforts on other Mopar vehicles, and Chrysler is left with just a single model, the Pacifica.
That is so weird. I will show this after. I'll go to their website. How weird that you have a whole car company still, like Chrysler cars, right? But there's one car. Like, does that even count as a car company? Like, remember when companies used to have like 15 cars to choose from? That's so weird.
Pacifica minivan. But that one is pretty good from what I've read, so that's okay.
It is.
And
they still
those
sell.
are the reasons why American cars in Europe failed. Thank you so much for watching this video.
Okay, so I think this is like both a simple and complex topic. It could be answered simply, and if you wanted a more complex dive into it, it could be, a complex deep dive into this as well. I think overall, from watching this and from hearing what you guys say, and I would love to hear more in the comments, to kind of wrap this topic up, is American cars are just different, right? So that's what makes the world go round, is there's differences. There's differences in culture. There's differences in people, in terrain, in roads, and whatever, right? That goes for anything, any industry. American cars are, go figure, mostly designed for here. And a lot of them do well here. A Chevy Suburban does make sense in parts of the U.S., whereas it wouldn't make sense in the U.K., right? It wouldn't make sense in Portugal. I can totally understand that. Everything's based on scenarios. If you live in downtown Chicago, which is in the U.S., it is a lot tighter. There's more traffic. It's tight. You don't have room to park a Suburban, so that would be horrible. Now, having a European small hatchback like a Volkswagen Golf, that would make a lot more sense in Chicago. So do you see, there's always scenarios that can work for either or. But overall, I think the American cars were just not catered to Europe. The size was too big. The reliability was questionable. The features were probably less, bang for a buck. You could probably find an equivalent European car and like a similarly priced American car, and the American car might have felt cheaper. It might have felt like not, as good a quality and good of materials and whatever. So I get it. I could totally get that. Size issues, fuel issues. Our cars are not good on fuel, even smaller cars here. Yeah, do they get better fuel than, big trucks and SUVs? Sure. But they're not as good a fuel economy as you get from a lot of literal European cars. Don't you guys have hatchbacks with diesels and manual transmissions that get the equivalent here of probably 50 or 60 miles per gallon? I think you guys do. That's not happening in any American car. That's just not happening at all. The way I see it here in the U.S., if your car gets 30 or 32 miles a gallon, That's stellar. You know, like we're not hitting 60 or 50 miles a gallon. And of course, I'm talking about diesel and petrol cars. I'm not talking about EVs at all. And then also taste. Everyone's got different taste. There's people here that love foreign cars. There's people here that love Japanese cars. There's people here that love only German cars, and that's here in the U.S. Then I know there's people in Europe that prefer, you know, whatever they prefer, and their preferences just don't include American cars for a lot of reasons, and that's totally cool. I also know that there's probably just a very small following of people that might love American cars in Europe. They might like Camaros, and they might like American trucks. I know that exists as well, but of course that's not big enough to support a huge presence there. I will show you Chrysler.com just to prove it here. So Chrysler official site. Let me go here. Okay, so we're on Chrysler.com, at least for the US here. You go to vehicles. It says vehicles plural, right? Now watch what they do here. You would expect to see a whole laundry list of vehicles for a car company, right? They say vehicles plural. Really, it's the same vehicle. You have a Voyager, which is just a very like fleet-oriented, like very stripped-down van. And then you have the Pacifica hybrid, the plug-in hybrid. Then you have the Pacifica, just the petrol, like, you know, gas engine. So you have the Pacifica hybrid, and the Voyager. If you'll notice, they all look almost identical. Literally just different fascia and headlights on the Voyager to make it look cheaper, basically. And the Pacifica looks more, you know, elegant and luxurious. That's it. There you go. Also, minivans used to be like 23 grand brand new, literally 10, 15 years ago. And now, of course, they're almost 50 grand because it says MSRP starting at 42 for the Pacifica. But in reality, the ones you'll find at the dealers are always 48 to 50. I'm not making this up. So I think that's absurd and ridiculously expensive for a minivan. Anyway, that's a whole nother video. Thinking about the car industry at this point is at all-time low, unfortunately, in the U.S., I feel like, with prices and what you get. But anywho, I would love to see the comments on this one. I'm pretty sure it's going to be a good one for that. And, you know, do you like American cars? What reasons do you like them? Please tell me down below. And if you dislike them, I'm sure you'll tell me as well, and that's fair enough. Tell me what concerns you about American cars in your eyes. I found that interesting, and it is fun to see how different car culture, car preferences, and, you know, vehicle markets can be. At the end of the day, I really kind of appreciate them all for the differences, and you know me, I'm the weirdo that likes big American trucks. I like American muscle cars. But at the same time, daily driving, I actually really would prefer and find enjoyment out of a small-engined manual transmission vehicle. So go figure. I love European vehicles. That's just me. I'm weird like that. I appreciate you watching. It's going to do it for this one. My name is Ian. You're watching IWrocker. Until next time, y'all, have a great weekend. And I'll catch you later.